This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News, bringing you information and analysis about public policy stories that affect your life, your health, your freedoms, and the nation's economy. This week we're going to focus on the nation's economy. The reason we're going to do that is because we continue to hear more and more about spending and policies that are going to cost you a lot of money. So it's good for you to be informed and know about all these spending plans. So the first story, news coming out of budget and tax news, the story is spending, wage, and price hikes loom as Fed overheats the economy. So that sort of hits you between the eyes. So budget and tax news reports the Fed continues the easy money policies that are fueling the economy. So prices increased at about a 6% rate, and inflation now is at 5 to 6%. So driving prices to these extremes was rapid. It was a 13% rate increase in spending, the fastest quarterly increase in more than 40 years. Over the past year, spending rose by 17%, and that's the fastest yearly increase in 70 years. So this just takes us back to Econ 101. It's your basic supply and demand and inflation. So now we have, at this point, Americans are already well aware of inflation. We know that the supply chain was disrupted, so that slowed down a lot of the supply of different goods and consumer goods and all kinds of things. And then the demand increased rapidly. So with this huge increase in the demand and the constraint of the supply, we're already seeing this change in the economy, and inflation's here. Americans are well aware. They go to the grocery store, we go to the gas station, and already we can see that we're paying more. But the mainstream media continues to downplay it. And they keep repeating this mantra from the Biden administration that it's transitional inflation or transitory inflation. But even Fed Chairman Powell had to admit last week that he underestimated inflation. The Fed has attributed this explosive rise in spending and inflation to special factors associated with the reopening of the economy due to the pandemic. And these special factors did drive prices higher. That's true. However, the explosive increases could not have occurred without the Fed pouring massive new bank reserves and money into the economy. Without all that intrusion, you wouldn't see what you're seeing today. So by continuing the policies that have produced the current inflation, the Fed virtually guarantees further serious problems ahead and more inflation. So we know that's going to continue. But what's happening in the stock market? Well, corporate profits look good. Some of the largest companies outperformed already optimistic economic targets. Stocks continue to be driven by this ongoing unprecedented monetary ease. So it's the same monetary ease that's primarily responsible for the unprecedented spending and inflation. It's also responsible for the drive up of prices on the stock market. So currently you see the S&P is overvalued by 30%. That's a lot. And it's likely that interest rates will rise once the market finally recognizes this inflationary environment. So keep an eye on that. Again, as we've said many times, stock market continues to look great because it's rising, but the stock market goes two directions. It's not always up. So be prepared for something different. So inflationary concerns we've talked about. Inflation is something to be concerned about for a number of different reasons. So it's not just about we're worrying about today how much we're paying for our loaf of bread. There's other things. So beyond the fiscal burden, beyond what we're seeing today, and even beyond what we're seeing and what we could anticipate is going to happen to our children and grandchildren with all this inflation, with all the excess spending and the increased taxes, there's other more immediate reasons to be concerned about the Biden excessive spending policies and this current inflation. So data provided by the Heritage Foundation, the foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, contains ample evidence from around the world that widening deficits and a growing debt burden will erode a country's economic vitality. It strips the people of their economic freedom and condemns them to the mercy of government edicts and orders. And this prevents them from using their own ingenuity and creativity, entrepreneurial skills to thrive. So it suppresses all those things. And we recently had a little taste of this through the pandemic. We had a lot of oppression. People weren't allowed to conduct their businesses in large part, and we saw a lot of government edicts. So as far as the report from Heritage, the U.S. has fallen to 20th place, the 20th place in the world in economic freedom out of 178 countries rated. We're now in the middle of the rankings considered mostly free out of all the other countries. And that's our lowest ranking ever. And it's almost entirely due to this decline in fiscal health. And this fiscal health is calculated based on government debt and deficits. So that's a big deal to continue this deficit spending. The U.S. fiscal health score in 2021 is a very poor 34.9 out of 100. By contrast, the 5 countries making the cut as economically free have an average fiscal health score of 91.4. So unsound government fiscal positions have often disrupted macroeconomic stability and induced economic uncertainty in countries around the world. And economic freedom is not automatic, it's not a given, it's not a guarantee. And that's a government responsibility to limit its debt and deficits, to look out for the spending of the country. And if we're to preserve our fundamental liberties, we need to be looking at this. We need to be concerned about inflation. We need to be concerned about debt spending. Because beyond just the dollars and cents, it's about economic freedom, and that translates into personal freedom. And that's an important point to make. Now, our government doesn't seem to be pulling back at all right now. Our government seems to be pressing ahead with continued government spending and massive proposals for more government spending, which will also require more taxes. So that's interesting. Why wouldn't we want to be looking at economic freedom and letting that continue to give us reason and rationale to tighten our fiscal purse strings? Now, the good news in this is that policies detrimental to the fiscal health and economic freedom of our country are currently being rejected. And you see a lot of awareness now, which we didn't always see before in American citizens. We're seeing a lot more awareness than we did in the past. And we're seeing awareness not just in regular citizens, but at different levels of our elected leaders. So at the state level, we're seeing some response. So as Nathan Benefield writes for Near Clear Policy, and on Budget and Tax News, you can read the full article, but it's limited government can make a comeback in the pandemic era. So he points out that after what we've seen during the pandemic, it gives people pause to say, we've seen what excess government looks like. Maybe we need to go back and push back to where we had limited government. It's a good point. So while the federal government is currently on this spending spree, it hasn't gone unnoticed. We're aware of this. And the local leaders at the state and local level are aware of this also. So state leaders and the American people are starting to take a stand. This year's federal deficit is set to match the entire 1996 federal budget adjusted for inflation. But despite such overwhelming spending, Democrats in Congress have proposed an unprecedented $3.5 trillion budget. And that's in addition to the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that so far has failed. So more spending, more proposals for more spending with no end in sight. So for advocates of limited government, it's easy to feel frustrated and discouraged, but there's hope. The hope for the future is that basic economic understanding of consumer goods and prices and inflation will come home and everybody will start looking at what we can do individually. And instead of looking at the federal level, let's look at our state and local leaders and see if they can't adjust policies. And as these prices for basic consumer goods increase, people are already worried about inflation, despite what the mainstream media says or what the Biden administration says. And any request for relief seems to fall on deaf ears as they continue this push for massive government spending and demanding higher taxes to pay for all these things. So Americans are already fed up with paying more for gas and groceries. Wait till they see how much more they're going to spend when they have to pay more in taxes. So one of the silver linings of COVID was that it pulled back the curtain on government control and power. We saw some governors turn tyrannical, while others displayed leadership during the crisis. The difference was stark, and the consequences continue to be felt. And it's no mystery why there's an explosion of outmigration in some of the states that are highest taxed and worst managed. California, New York, and Illinois spring to mind. You may think of a few others, but those states that are the high tax states that struggled through the pandemic with the most oppressive responses to the pandemic, and that continue to be very poorly managed in a number of different ways, a number of different metrics we can evaluate that on. But after seeing oppressive power on display, many state legislatures are also taking action. So at the state level, again, we see a lot of hope. We see a lot of push towards doing things that are more in the interest of citizens and not in the interest of just government. Right now, about 45 states are considering proposals to reduce their governor's emergency powers, to restore checks and balances into the system, so they can't have this oppressive power. And there's a bipartisan trend even towards reducing executive power, following what some would say was an abuse of power at the governor level. Nearly a dozen states have already adopted such policies. So after the pandemic, there's a counter movement against government overreach. We have put up with the oppressive regulations, the growing intrusions, all these things that have expanded in the last number of years. But when they told Americans when and when they couldn't go to church or to school or to the grocery store, and even to the point of determining which island Walmart people could shop in, well, Americans said, enough. And there has been a response. And thankfully, state leaders, like some of the governors, Governor DeSantis, Governor Abbott, and many state legislators took up this cause and they also decided enough was enough. Americans don't like seeing their hard-earned money being wasted. And the federal government has a long history of wasteful spending. And the Biden administration seems to be putting all that on steroids. So there will be excessive spending. That means there'll be excessive waste. So there may be a whole new standard of spending and waste in our future. But between all these things that we've seen and we've observed and we've experienced in recent memory, between the wasteful spending, the onerous regulations, the oppressive COVID responses and mandates, the coercive approach now to vaccinations, and overall oppressive power grab, now may be the perfect time for a new push for limited government. We learned a lot in the pandemic. And as we've heard some people say, never let a crisis go to waste. So that's the news for this week at the Heartland View. If you'd like to see the details on all these stories, all this information about what's happening inflation-wise, what's happening with government spending, please go to the website to look at all these news articles, heartlanddailynews.com. And if you're interested in the Heartland Institute and the work that is going on there, all the effort, please go to heartland.org. There's no shortage of information. As always, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.